Do you know what the realm is? It's the 1,000 blades of Aegon's enemies. A story we agree to tell each other over and over till we forget that it's a lie.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back for another A Song of Ice and Fire video. As you all know, I have been making videos on every chapter in the A Song of Ice and Fire book series. Like I have said before, I know many of you have still not read them, so I thought this would be a great way for you to find out exactly what happens in the books. As great as the show was in the early seasons, there was still a lot of very interesting details left out. Now you will know why some of us believe the books are so much better than the show. In this video, I will be discussing what happens in Ned Stark's very first chapter. Once again, this is another chapter that is just loaded with information. Not only does Ned's first chapter shed some light on certain historical events, but it also foreshadows many different things that will happen in the future. As I have said before, the first book, Game of Thrones, has a lot of information that may reveal how this entire series will end. Ned Stark's chapter is a great example of this. We also get some more insight into Ned and Robert's relationship. Now, I did go over some of this during Lady Catelyn's chapter, but now you will see them interacting face to face. What makes this even more interesting is that we are inside Ned Stark's head during all of this, so we will know exactly what he thinks or how he feels whenever something significant is mentioned. Now, I will say the first few minutes of this chapter won't be extremely exciting, but just wait until we go into the crypts beneath Winterfell. Now we will enter the mind of Ned Stark as we see the events unfold through his eyes. Shall we begin? At the beginning of the chapter, we see the arrival of King Robert of House Baratheon. This is an incredible opening scene, because we will never see all of these amazing characters in the same location together again. When the gates of Winterfell open up, hundreds of bannermen and knights, sworn swords and free riders arrive with Robert Baratheon. Like we saw in the show, this is also when we meet Sir Jaime Lannister, who has hair as bright as beaten gold, and Sandor Clegane with his burned face. Right beside him was everyone's favorite character, Joffrey, and behind them was a stunted little man who was none other than Tyrion Lannister. When Robert arrives through the gates of Winterfell, Ned thinks about how he almost seems like a stranger. It has been so many years since they have seen each other. Robert says Ned hasn't changed at all. Ned wishes he could say the same thing. He thinks about the old Robert from 15 years ago, the man who he helped take the Iron Throne. Back then, when Robert was still the Lord of Storm's End, he had been clean-shaven, clear-eyed, and muscled like a maiden's fantasy. Now, you would never know this from the show, but the Robert from the books is 6.5 feet tall. The man is an absolute giant. Back then, he had the strength of a giant too. Robert's weapon of choice was a spiked iron warhammer that Ned could barely lift. Now think about that for a second. Even when Ned Stark would use both of his hands, he could barely lift Robert's warhammer. But Robert could swing and kill while only using one hand. The man was a straight-up savage. This isn't the same Robert that Ned sees now. He now has the weight to match his height. And let's face it, Robert Baratheon is washed up by the time we meet him. This makes Ned think about the last time he saw Robert, which was 9 years ago during the Greyjoy Rebellion. This was when Theon's father, Balon Greyjoy, tried to break away from the Seven Kingdoms to secure independence for the Iron Islands and restore the old way, which was lost almost 300 years ago during Aegon's conquest. Robert and Ned had joined their forces, and together they crushed the Greyjoy Rebellion. Not only was Balon Greyjoy stopped, but Robert also made him bend that knee, which he did. Just to make sure Balon never rose up again, Ned Stark took his last remaining heir, Theon Greyjoy, back to Winterfell to live with him and his family. So as you can see, Robert and Ned worked very well together. Now they obviously had some help, but they were able to secure the Iron Throne for Robert by defeating House Targaryen. And whenever a house tried to rise up against them, they would beat them back into submission as well. Those were the good old days. Now Robert was overweight and looking old. He has a big stomach and a big beard to hide his double chin. Ned also notices he has dark circles under his eyes. It's obvious that Robert has become very lazy. He has been neglecting all of his duties as the king. All he wants to do is get drunk and have fun. I mean, who doesn't want to do that every now and then? But this worries Ned. This isn't the same Robert he has known for all these years. If Robert wasn't the king, I swear he would have became the neighborhood bum that sits in front of the liquor store all day drinking 40s out of a brown bag. However, it doesn't really matter what Ned thinks, because Robert is his king, not only just his friend. Now, just like we saw in the show, Ned says, "Your Grace, Winterfell is yours." This is also the same thing we heard Sansa say when Daenerys first arrived in Winterfell. Right after Ned says this is when Cersei Lannister and her children step out of the carriage into the courtyard. Now, the carriage Cersei rode in during the show is nothing like the one she rode in during her arrival at Winterfell. Their wheelhouse in the books is a double-decker carriage that has to be driven by 40 heavy horses. This thing is so massive, it's not able to fit through Winterfell's main gate. And I must say, the Lannisters of House Kardashian sure do know how to ride in style. Then we go through the formalities of everyone greeting everyone, same as we saw in the show. This is followed up by Robert asking Ned to take him down to see Lyanna. It says Ned loves him for this. Even after all these years, Robert still remembers her. And you would think that Ned already knows how much Lyanna's death affected him. Robert would never forget about Lyanna. Later in this chapter, Ned even thinks about how Robert loved her more than he did. They went down to the crypt together, Ned and this king he scarcely recognized. Robert begins to talk about his journey north and how empty all the lands were. He wonders, where is everyone? And Ned says they were likely too shy to come out. Kings are hardly ever seen in the north. Robert snorted. More likely they were hiding under the snow. Now, if you are reading this very carefully, you would have noticed that this was a hidden reference to Jon Snow actually being the king of the Seven Kingdoms. Ned said, "Kings are a rare sight in the north," but Robert says, more likely they were hiding under the snow. I believe this is a hidden message from George R.R. Martin, letting us know there is a king in the north who is hiding under the snow, as in the name Snow. It's no coincidence we are given this big clue right as Ned and Robert are about to go see Jon Snow's real mother, Lyanna. Ned will soon be thinking about the promise he made to Lyanna. This is of course when Ned hides Jon's identity by saying he is his son, and giving him the bastard name Snow. The way George snuck this line in there is genius. These little hidden messages are scattered throughout all the books. So, as Ned and Robert are descending further and further into the crypts of Winterfell, they talk about how bad the winters are in the north. Ned says, "The winters are hard, but the Starks will endure. We always have." I believe this is also some foreshadowing for how the books will end. This may have even been confirmed in the Game of Thrones television show. A Song of Ice and Fire is a generational saga, where we follow the lives of many different characters, but it's mostly the children in this story who we will follow until the very end. At the beginning, we follow Ned Stark, who seems to be the main character of the series, but then he dies, and then his wife, and then his oldest son, who we believed would go on to avenge his father's death. Right when it seems like all hope is lost for House Stark, winter finally comes, and this is where the Starks shine brightest. We saw how things ended for House Stark in the show. Bran Stark became the king of Westeros, Sansa Stark became the queen of the north, Arya Stark went to go see what was west of Westeros, and Jon Snow went into the far north, where he basically became the king beyond the wall. The ending may have been bittersweet, but the Starks did get some big victories in the end. Now I know we're talking about the books here, but this may happen in the books as well. George R. R. Martin has said the A Song of Ice and Fire series will consist of 7 books. As of right now, we are waiting for book number 6, The Winds of Winter. Some of you might not know this, but book number 7 was originally going to be called A Time for Wolves. George R. R. Martin did eventually change the name to A Dream of Spring, but his original title may have given us a glimpse into the future. That's why I think Ned was foreshadowing what would happen to House Stark when he said, "The Starks will endure the winter, as they always have." Alright, so as they are walking to Lyanna's statue, Robert begins to sell Ned on the idea of coming south with him. Robert says, "You need a taste of the summer before it flees," and Robert describes how amazing things are in the south. He tells Ned about how there are fields of golden roses as far as the eyes can see. There are fruits so ripe they instantly explode in your mouth. The summer wines are so cheap and so good that you can get drunk just by breathing in the air. There are flowers everywhere, and the markets are loaded with food. And the girls, Ned. Oh god, the girls. I swear, women lose all modesty in the heat. They swim naked in the river right below the castle. Even when they do wear clothes, it's so hot outside, their clothes stick to their skin, and they might as well be naked anyway. I mean, Robert is really selling this to Ned. Robert knows he is about to ask Ned to come south with him to be his Hand of the King. He knows Ned will not want to leave his home and his family so easily, so he makes it sound like it will be the greatest experience he can ever have. For a brief moment, Robert becomes a salesman, and he does everything he can to set his hooks in Ned. But Robert should know better than this. The Honorable Ned Stark does not get excited over the thought of young, hot women running around naked in the streets. Oh no 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 no. That's not the Ned we know and love. In fact, Ned even thinks about this, and this may be seen as more evidence that Ned is not actually Jon Snow's father. Right after Robert tells Ned about all these amazing things in the South, Ned thinks to himself, Robert had always been a man of big appetites, a man who knew how to take his pleasures. Then Ned thinks, that was not a charge anyone could lay at the door of Eddard Stark. We are led to believe Ned Stark cheated on his wife Catelyn, which resulted in him having a bastard child, Jon Snow. However, when Robert Baratheon tells Ned about all the different women in the South running around naked, Ned doesn't even flinch, and that's because Ned would never cheat on his wife. When we are inside Ned's head, we are getting his honest thoughts. He doesn't have to lie to himself to save Jon. He only has to do that in front of everyone else. Ned knows the truth, but George R. R. Martin can't allow Ned to have those exact thoughts this early in the story, or it would ruin the big reveal later. Now let's move on to what the chapter says next. I believe this is where we get even more foreshadowing. This is where we get some hints that those statues in the crypts of Winterfell may rise from the dead, so to speak. As Robert and Ned descend deeper and deeper into the crypts, the statues almost seem to come alive as their shadows run away from the light from their lantern. As the flickering light from their lantern shines on the stone statues, the shadows seem to move around. Ned thinks about how the statues' eyes seem to follow them as they walk in front of them. There are so many references to this in this one scene alone. We saw what happened in the crypts during Season 8, when the Night King and his army of the dead were in Winterfell. I think this is something Dan and Dave most likely got from George R. R. Martin. As you can see, it looks as if he has been foreshadowing this from the very beginning of the books. And I happen to think there is something much darker down below Winterfell. I have made videos about this before, and I even mentioned it in one of my most recent videos where I went over some of the connections between House Stark and the White Walkers. I happen to think there may be a Night's King or a Night's Queen buried down in the crypts below Winterfell. Many of the statues down here are the old kings of winter, and I think the Night King could be seen as the ultimate king of winter. When the White Walkers came during the Long Night, I think this is the exact location where winter fell, hence the name of the Stark's castle. Not to mention their house words are winter is coming. All these references are a reminder of what happened here roughly 8,000 years ago. Something is down there in the crypts, just waiting to rise from the dead. Whenever we hear about the White Walkers in the books, they are mostly described as shadows moving through the woods. As Robert and Ned are walking down here, Ned thinks about how the statues seem to be coming alive as their shadows move around again and again. Now what I find to be very interesting is what it says next. As Robert and Ned are walking to Lyanna's statue, Ned thinks about how the iron longswords are laid across the laps of each who had been Lord of Winterfell to keep the vengeful spirits in their crypts. But Ned also thinks about how these iron longswords are starting to rust away, and this makes him very worried. He is worried that these vengeful spirits will be able to escape from their crypts. Now why would he be worried about that? If these are his own family members, why would he be so afraid of them? I think it's because something else is down here, and although Ned doesn't know exactly what it is, deep down he's afraid of what it could be. The original Night's King was the 13th Lord Commander at the Night Fort on the Wall. He married a woman that could only be described as a female White Walker. They were married for 13 years, and during that whole time, they were sacrificing children to the White Walkers beyond the Wall. However, the Night King's brother, who was the Stark in Winterfell, joined his forces with the King beyond the Wall, and together they were able to defeat the Night's King and his corpse queen. I think the Stark in Winterfell brought the Night's King back to Winterfell since they were brothers and locked him up in the crypts beneath the castle. After all, this is where the Starks do bury their dead. I think there is even a chance that the Night's Queen was locked up down there as well. This is why they started laying iron longswords across the laps of the statues, to keep the vengeful spirits within the crypts. Old Nan even tells us there are a few things the White Walkers hate. She says one of those things just so happens to be iron, but now these iron longswords are rusting away, and one day these spirits may rise again. Now I'm sure most of you have seen my most recent video where I went over all of this, so I won't do it here again. But just try to remember some of these details and some of these references, because I will mention them in some of my other chapter videos whenever more evidence is revealed. I think this is why there are so many references to shadows moving around in the crypts. Not only will they come alive like they did in Season 8 of Game of Thrones, but I think there will also be a leader down here as well, like one of the original Night's Kings, who was a Stark. Alright, now let's move on. Ned stopped at the last and lifted his oil lantern. The crypts continued on into the darkness ahead of them, but beyond them the tombs were empty and unsealed. Black holes waiting for their dead, waiting for him and his children. Ned did not like to think of that. Right here, he told his king. Robert nodded silently, knelt, and bowed his head. There were 3 statues side by side. Lord Rickard Stark, Ned's father, had a long, stern face. The stone mason had known him well. On either sides of him were his children. Brandon Stark had been 20 when he died, strangled by the order of the Mad King Aerys Targaryen only a few short days before he was to wed Catelyn Tully of Riverrun. His father had been forced to watch him die. Lyanna had only been 16 when she died. Ned had loved her with all his heart. Robert had loved her even more. She was to have been his bride. She was more beautiful than that, Robert said, after a silence. His eyes lingered on Lyanna's face, as if he could will her back to life. So it's obvious that Robert was greatly affected by the death of Lyanna, and I do wonder, if Lyanna had lived and married Robert, would he have become the absolute mess that he is now? I forget the exact line in the show, but Robert said something along the lines of, when Lyanna died, it left a hole in his heart that not even the 7 kingdoms could fill. Now, maybe this is just a credit to the acting during that scene, but I did believe Robert when he said that. But, as we all know, Lyanna did not love Robert. Running off with Rhaegar Targaryen was very irresponsible considering what it led to. However, I don't blame her for wanting to be with the one she actually loved. If only they would have done it the right way, but then we would not have this amazing story, so I suppose it had to happen that way. Then Ned reminds Robert, I was with her when she died. She wanted to come home, to rest beside her father and Brandon. He could still hear her at times. Promise me, she had cried, in a room that smelled of blood and roses. Promise me, Ned. The fever had taken her strength, and her voice had been faint as a whisper, but when he gave her his word, the fear had gone out of his sister's eyes. Ned remembered the way she had smiled then, how tightly her fingers clutched his as she gave up hold on her life. After that, he remembered nothing. Now, I don't think I need to dive too deep into this. I believe what we saw in the show is more or less what we will see in the books. Right before Lyanna died, she gave Ned her son to keep as his own, and I think there is more than enough evidence in the books to show that Jon Snow is the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. I may even release a video where I show all the book evidence I have found that shows Jon Snow is the next in line for the Iron Throne. Alright, so then Robert says, I vowed to kill Rhaegar for what he did to her. You did, Ned reminds him. Only once, Robert said bitterly. They had come together at the Fort of the Trident while the battle crashed around them. Robert with his warhammer and his great antlered helm, the Targaryen prince armored all in black. On his breastplate was the 3-headed dragon of his house, wrought all in rubies that flashed like fire in the sunlight. The waters of the Trident ran red around the hooves of their destriers as they circled and clashed again and again, until at last, a crushing blow from Robert's hammer stove in the dragon and the chest beneath it. When Ned had finally come on the scene, Rhaegar lay dead in the stream, while men of both armies scrambled in the swirling waters for rubies knocked free of his armor. In my dreams, I kill him every night, Robert admitted. 1,000 deaths will still be less than he deserves. There was nothing Ned could say to that. This chapter is just loaded with so much information. As I said before, it's easily one of my favorite in a Game of Thrones. You can see that Robert may have just as much hatred for Rhaegar as he does love for Lyanna. This one event essentially led to the current story we know and love today. Rhaegar and Lyanna running off together is what led to so many things happening, like the birth of Jon Snow, Robert killing Rhaegar and defeating his army, Brandon Stark and his father getting killed, which led to Ned getting Winterfell and marrying Catelyn, which led to them having all their children. Rhaegar's defeat also led to the sack of King's Landing, which led to Jaime killing the Mad King. Jon Arryn helping Robert and Ned during this is what led to Robert naming him his Hand of the King. And then his death led to Robert coming to Winterfell to ask Ned to be his new Hand of the King, and so on and so forth. As Ned and Robert leave the crypts, they begin to speak about Jon Arryn's death. Robert doesn't know what to make of it. He has never seen a man sicken so quickly. One day he's fine, and you think he will live forever, and then a fortnight later, he's dead. The sickness was like a fire in his gut, and it burned right through him. You have to remember, Robert and Ned loved Jon Arryn like a father. They grew up together at the Eyrie, which is one of the reasons why Ned and Robert are more like brothers than friends. Now, one thing we do not see in the show is what Robert intended to do with Jon Arryn's son, the little sickly Robert Arryn, who is named after Robert Baratheon, I might add. In the books, Robert Baratheon wanted Lysa and Jon's son to be fostered at Casterly Rock with Tywin Lannister. Robert said Jon has no brothers and no other sons. Was I supposed to leave him to be raised by women? But we all know how protective Lysa is over her sweet Robin. She wasn't about to allow Robert to send him to live with Tywin Lannister. So she left King's Landing in the middle of the night, and this made Cersei Lannister furious. This was like a slap in the face, because letting sweet Robin foster at Casterly Rock should have been seen as a great honor. Now Ned doesn't say it out loud, but he thinks Lysa may have done the right thing. He would not want his son fostered with the Lannisters either. Ned offers Robert to allow him to take Sweet Robin as his ward, if he would allow it. Ned thinks Lysa would allow that considering he is married to her sister. However, Robert declines that offer from Ned. He said it's too late. Lord Tywin already agreed to take him. Fostering the boy anywhere else would be seen as a grievous affront to him. And I love what Ned says next. He says, "I have more concern for my nephew's welfare than I do for Lannister pride." Robert says, "Well, that is because you do not sleep with a Lannister." This makes Robert laugh. And as I said in my Catelyn chapter video, Ned has no respect for House Lannister. He still hasn't forgiven them for their lack of effort during Robert's rebellion. While everyone else was fighting, Tywin Lannister sat at Casterly Rock and waited until he knew which side would win. It wasn't until Rhaegar and his army fell that he decided he would declare for House Baratheon.
My father won the real war. He killed Prince Rhaegar. He took the crown while you hid under Casterly Rock.
That's when he sacked King's Landing. So as you can see, Ned does not care about hurting their feelings. If the Lannisters see Ned fostering Robin as a slap in the face, then so be it. I mean, what are they going to do about it anyway? So now we're at the moment where Robert wants to know if Ned will become his new Hand of the King. Robert says, "These are difficult times, Ned. I need good men around me. Men like Jon Arryn. Those years we spent in the Eyrie, gods, those were good years, Ned. I want you at my side again. I want you down in King's Landing. Not up here at the end of the world where you are no use to anybody. You are the only one, my old friend." Robert smiled. "Lord Eddard Stark, I would name you the Hand of the King." This did not surprise Ned. Why else would Robert come all this way? The Hand of the King was the second most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms. He spoke with the king's voice, commanded the king's armies, and drafted the king's laws. At times, he even sat upon the Iron Throne to dispense the king's justice when the king was absent or sick. Robert was offering him a responsibility as large as the realm itself, but it was the last thing Ned wanted. No matter how amazing Robert made the South sound, Ned did not want to leave Winterfell. Now Robert tries to lighten the mood by laughing, but Ned doesn't want to hear it. Robert says, "You might at least humor me with a smile. Come south with me, and I will teach you how to laugh again." If Lyanna had lived, we would have been brothers, bound by blood, not just affection. Well, it's not too late. I have a son, you have a daughter. My Joff and your Sansa shall join our houses, as Lyanna and I might have once have done. This offer does surprise Ned. Ned says Sansa is only 11 years old, and Robert says, old enough for a betrothal. The marriage can wait a few years. The king smiled. Now stand up and say yes. Nothing would give me greater pleasure, your grace. Now we all know this is a lie. Ned doesn't want to be Hand of the King, and he surely doesn't want Sansa to marry Joffrey. But Robert is his king. Ned says, "These honors are all so unexpected. May I have some time to consider? I need to tell my wife." Robert says, yes, of course. Sleep on it if you must, but do hurry. I am not a very patient man." The chapter ends as it says, "For a moment, Eddard Stark was filled with a terrible sense of foreboding. This was his place, here in the north. He looked at the stone figures all around them, breathed in the chill silence of the crypt, He could feel the eyes of the dead. They were all listening, he knew, and winter was coming. As you can see, the chapter ends with us getting another reference to the statues watching and listening, right before Ned thinks about winter coming. I think this is just another example of the Stark's connection to the White Walkers and how the statues below their castle may have vengeful spirits waiting to rise up again. Now you see why this is such a great chapter. It is loaded with so much information. Not only does it fill us in on some of the amazing backstory, like the history between Robert, Rhaegar, and Lyanna, but also the foreshadowing of future events, like how House Stark's story may end. Let me know what you thought about this chapter. Do you think I'm misreading some of this stuff? Or do you have something you want to add? I would love to see what you have to say. I want to thank everyone for watching the video, especially for those of you that made it all the way until the end. I hope you all have a great day. I will see you again very soon. Bye.